If there's one thing I hate, one thing I can't stand, one thing I just cannot do, it's make an uninformed purchase. And yet despite that, when I walk into a store, I'm going straight past the salespeople.
Hi there. Is there a project you're working on?
I know more than you.
All right.
And it's not to be rude or that I don't value their input, but if I haven't researched something for hours by myself, I'm not gonna buy it. That's just the way I am. One of the most common questions I get asked is, what camera should I buy? Or I have X amount of money, what's the best camera? And the truth of the matter is, there's not a one camera fits all solution for you. Do you shoot more photo, more video? Do you film yourself and make YouTube videos? Or do you do freelance work? It's just a very complicated topic. If you're looking to get the absolute best bang for your buck for your style of shooting, even cameras in the same price range can have pretty drastic differences. And the tricky thing is, a lot of these differences aren't super obvious. So in this video, we're going over 25 different features to look for to make sure your next camera is the best fit for you. Alright, so one of the first things to look at is the different picture profiles that a camera comes with. A lot of entry-level cameras just come with standard picture profiles. That might be called standard, neutral, faithful, and these are gonna have good saturation, good contrast, and look pretty good right out of camera. Sort of a step up from that are log profiles, like I'm filming on right now. Now, log profiles look super flat. Frankly, they look terrible straight out of camera. They have no contrast, no saturation, but the advantage is you can grade it in post. Plus, it has a greater dynamic range than a standard picture profile. With log profiles, you have a lot more detail in the highlights, a lot more detail in the shadows, and you can take all that information and grade it exactly how you want it to look in post. When shooting in a log profile, your footage is gonna look a lot more professional and a lot more cinematic, but the biggest downside is you can't use it straight out of camera. It looks terrible. You have to take it into post-production. And then there's raw video, which is a step even further beyond log. It's gonna have even more data preserved. You can really push and pull colors. The biggest downside though is file sizes are massive. All right, and the next thing to take a look at is the resolution of your camera. If you're taking photos, this is measured in megapixels. In video, it's pretty much just called resolution. Now, generally speaking, if you're taking photos, you want as many pixels, as much resolution as possible. Sort of on the low end, a lot of cameras have 18 megapixels. Mid-range ones are maybe 24 to 30, and then your high-end cameras have 30 plus megapixels. For video on kind of the lower end, there's 1080p. You really don't want to buy a camera that can't record in at least that. In the middle, you've got 2.7K, 4K, and on the high end, we've got cameras shooting 5K, 6K, 8K. Blackmagic has a 12K camera nowadays. In terms of resolution, bigger is pretty much always better. The only downside is your file sizes are gonna be much bigger, so you're gonna have to spend more on storage, plus photo and video of higher resolution is a little bit more intensive to edit. You're gonna need a beefier computer. And the next thing to look at is color science. And color science is how your camera renders the colors from real life and converts them into an image. Some cameras are gonna have very saturated colors. They might be a little more green overall, a little more pink. Sometimes it'll be more contrasty, less contrasty. For the most part, I would say everyone's color science is pretty good. Canon historically has been kind of the leader in color science, but Sony and Nikon are kind of catching up. Personally, I like Canon colors a lot, but this is totally preference, very subjective. It's just good to know that different cameras are gonna render colors differently. Okay, next we've got dynamic range, and dynamic range is the range of exposure values your camera can capture. That's a little confusing, so let me explain. Alright, so sort of going back to picture profiles, something with a standard picture profile is gonna have less dynamic range than something with a log picture profile. Now, when you have less dynamic range, your shadows are gonna get crushed. They're gonna turn to black a lot quicker if you're exceeding the dynamic range that your camera can capture. Likewise, your highlights are gonna blow out, they're gonna clip, they're gonna turn pure white because your camera can't capture detail in the shadows and the highlights. Meanwhile, if you have a log picture profile, you're gonna have a lot more detail in those shadows, and your sky's not gonna blow out and turn pure white if you try and expose for those shadows. Especially in video, having a higher dynamic range with something like a log profile is gonna make your footage look a lot more cinematic. Alright, and next we've got sensor size, and the big ones to look at are you've got full frame sensors and crop sensors. Full frame are bigger, they're gonna have a shallower depth of field, they're gonna have better low light performance, and also a wider field of view. Meanwhile, crop sensors are gonna be smaller, and it's gonna be the opposite of all of that. When comparing DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, there's really no dispute that full frame is better for pretty much everyone, but the biggest drawback is the camera bodies cost a lot more, and on top of that, all of the lenses cost more. So unless you're highly invested in photo video, or you're trying to make a career or do this at a very high level, crop sensors are gonna get the job done for most people. Alright, and next we've got low light performance. All you really need to know about this is full frame sensors typically have better low light performance than crop sensors. And the other thing to know is Sony is sort of just the king of low light. If you buy a camera from Sony, the comparable ones from every other manufacturer pretty much always have worse low light performance. Sony's just doing awesome in that department. But here's the tricky part. Things like dynamic range and low light performance aren't super, they're not really advertised. They can be tricky to figure out. So if you're trying to compare different camera models, a site like DxOMark is awesome. You can look at different cameras, they give them a number of value that you can compare to other cameras, comparing dynamic range, color depth, ISO performance, all that stuff. Alright, and next we've got frame rates, which is a video feature. Now, using different frame rates like 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, or 60 frames per second allows you to just get a different look from your footage, but on top of that, it also determines how much you can slow down that footage. So typically you don't want to go below 24 frames per second. This is real time. 30 frames per second can get you to about 80% speed. 60 frames per second can get you to about 40% speed. 120 frames per second can get you to about 20% speed. And anything past that is very slow motion. Unless you're specifically doing work that involves a lot of slow motion, 120 frames per second is good enough for most people. Even 60 is good enough for most people. Alright, next we've got photos per second, which is obviously a photo feature. Generally speaking, more is better. If you're shooting sports, you just want as many as possible. If you're shooting stills or landscapes, maybe not quite as big of a deal. But generally speaking, most people just want their camera to take as many photos as possible. Ugh, gonna pop the back. All right, let's talk stabilization. All right, so some cameras unfortunately don't have any stabilization. This can obviously look a little bit shaky, especially if you're shooting handheld video. Other cameras like my EOS R have electronic stabilization, which crops in on your camera, reduces the resolution a little bit, but it smooths out your shot. I actually really like this. It helps a lot with handheld video. And then the third most common form of stabilization is IBIS, which physically moves the camera sensor around to compensate for shakes. Very similar to electronic in performance, but it doesn't crop in on the sensor. Alright, and feature number 10 is autofocus. Obviously, a camera can have no autofocus, meaning you have to manually turn that lens to pull focus on a subject. After that, a lot of cameras these days have face tracking, which means it tracks the face of a subject, which is pretty good, pretty helpful. But a lot of cameras, again, like my EOS R, it's right here, that's why I keep saying that. Did I mention I shoot on an EOS R? But sort of a step past face tracking is eye tracking. It locks onto your actual eye with a lot of precision. If you shoot portraits or people in general, it's actually insane how easy this makes your life. If you're coming from a DSLR where you gotta manually move those focus points around, eye tracking is incredible. Alright, another feature to look for, especially if you're a video shooter, is some sort of focus assist. So something like focus peaking, when you're focusing manually, has a bunch of red dots, or it can be blue or green or yellow, but it shows you what's in focus. It looks at high contrast points and tells you what's in focus. It has a visual representation, and it is amazing for shooting video. Okay, another thing to look at is battery life. Obviously, having crappy battery life sucks. There are some cinema cameras out there that you pretty much can't use an internal battery, and you have to wire them to a V-mount because they go through them in like 10 minutes. Every camera is different, and you might not need incredible battery life, but getting something that's somewhat energy efficient is very helpful. It just makes using your camera a lot more fun. Another thing to look at is mirrorless versus DSLR. Some of you don't want to hear this. DSLRs are dead. No one's making DSLRs anymore. Mirrorless is the way of the future. If this is something you want to be into for a while, really dive into the hobby, maybe at some point you want to be the guy getting the newest gear every time something comes out, mirrorless is the way to go. There's a couple drawbacks, but overall it's just better. The advantage to DSLRs is they're going to be a little bit cheaper, and on top of that, all of the lenses are going to be cheaper than mirrorless lenses. It's already pretty much been determined they're not going to be making new DSLR lenses. They're not going to make new DSLRs. For the next few years, they're still very, very usable, but mirrorless is the way of the future. Okay, and another thing to look at is, does your camera come with a flash or not? Believe it or not, a lot of cameras don't. Something like the Canon 80D has a built-in flash, while something like my USR has no flash. Now, typically a flash doesn't look very good. It kind of reminds me of those photos my parents have of like when I was 6 years old around the Christmas tree. You know the ones, those family photos with a horrendous flash, everyone's got red eye. Having a flash, I guess, is better than not having a flash, even if it's not the best looking photo, right? It beats a super grainy one where you can't see anything. But if your camera doesn't come with a flash, getting an external flash is always going to be better than one built into the camera. Alright, the next thing to take a look at is what kind of storage your camera takes. Does it take an SD card, a CFast card, a CF Express card, maybe a micro SD card? Most cameras are going to take just an SD card. It's relatively cheap, somewhat fast with decent storage. The other ones might be a little faster, they might store even more, but they're going to be a lot more expensive. Another thing to look at is, does your camera have dual card slots? Cameras like my USR, haha, I shoot on an USR. Cameras like the one I'm shooting on now only have one card slot. If something happens to that SD card, I lose everything. A lot of professional cameras have 2 card slots, so you have a backup in camera. Before you even get to your computer, you've got 2 cards. If one gets lost or one gets corrupted, you've got a backup, you're good. Now, typically only higher end cameras have dual card slots, and my whole time of shooting, I've never had an SD card corrupt or had anything happen to the footage, but inevitably in the next 50 years, it'll probably happen at some point. Hopefully by then I have a dual SD card camera. Another thing to look at is the size and weight of your camera. I know I'm the type of guy who's always been like, doesn't matter. If this weighs 5 pounds, I'll lug it around. I'll dislocate my shoulder on a backpacking trip. I'm tough, I can handle it. But truth be told, hiking or backpacking or traveling or even just using your camera for an extended amount of time kinda sucks when it's big and heavy. Now, that doesn't really stop me from vlogging or using my camera a lot, but if that's something you're worried about, you don't want to hold a giant camera in front of you making YouTube videos or like while you're hiking up a mountain, it might result in you not taking your camera out as much at all. You might just start reaching for your phone. Something to think about. Size and weight does matter. Next, we've got ports, and ports are something that a lot of people might overlook, but they're super important, especially if you're a video shooter. I never would buy a camera that doesn't have a headphone jack so I can monitor audio when I'm shooting, or a mic jack so I can attach, you can't see it, but I'm filming on a boom mic right now. An HDMI port is gonna let you use an external monitor. That little circle jack is gonna let you use an intravolometer. And a USB-C port is gonna let you charge your camera, or maybe even pull focus. That's what I do with my gimbal. Just make sure the camera you're looking at has the ports you're gonna need. In terms of screens, there's gonna be a little difference in quality and resolution, but I don't feel like that's a huge deal, unless it's like absolutely terrible. But the big difference is what your screen can do. Is it fixed to the back of your camera? Doesn't move? Does it tilt up and down? Or is it a tilty flippy screen so you can tilt up and down, shoot low, shoot high, see yourself when you're filming a video like I am now? Just make sure the screen is going to be able to do everything you want. For a YouTube camera, I would not buy a camera that doesn't have a screen I can see myself. Yes, you could put an external monitor on top. That's a pain. If I'm shooting outside or I'm vlogging or even right here, I just want it built into the camera. That's a deal breaker for me. It might not matter for you. Another thing is ergonomics. I don't think anything will ever beat those Canon DSLR ergonomics. I think they're even better than the mirrorless ones. But again, if you're shooting for hours on end or you like to travel with your camera, ergonomics are a big deal. Some cameras, not gonna say any names, don't have the best ergonomics. If you don't hold your camera for hours, maybe it doesn't matter. It matters to me. Another thing to look at is your camera weather sealed? If you like to shoot in the rain or the dust or the sand, a weather sealed camera might very well save your camera, even if it costs a little more up front. Trust me, I would know. Another thing to consider is the viewfinder. DSLRs just have optical viewfinders, while mirrorless cameras have electronic ones. Electronic is arguably just better because you can see the adjustments you're making through the viewfinder, while on a DSLR it's a little more guess and check. I think in EVF, the electronic viewfinder is better than the DSLR, but it's just something to know about. Alright, just a couple more. Okay, so this is low-key the biggest factor, but also sort of kind of the least important. Camera manufacturer. You've got Canon, Nikon, Sony, Panasonic, Fujifilm, somebody else. Every camera manufacturer is gonna have strengths and they're gonna have weaknesses. Camera manufacturer is very much preference, but looking into some of those things, Canon, I would say, is not the best bang for the buck, but I still like them because they have things like the flip out screens. I like their colors. I think they're very easy to use, and I just enjoy shooting Canon cameras. I would say Sony is typically a better bang for the buck. You get things like incredible low light, but you might not get a flip screen and the colors might not be as good. Nikon, on the other hand, I don't know what's good about Nikon. Lens selection. So lens selection sort of goes with camera manufacturer, but it's still broken down in that area from like DSLRs and mirrorless cameras can use different lenses. Crop sensors and full frame cameras can use different lenses. Potentially before you even look at camera manufacturer, you might look at their lens selection, because choosing one brand over another could save you hundreds, maybe even $1,000 or $2,000, just depending on what lenses you want to buy. The exact same lenses could be cheaper from one manufacturer to another, or one manufacturer might have lenses that another one doesn't. There's just different lenses out there. Okay, and the last thing to look at, maybe not when you're shopping, but the last thing we're talking about is price. Now, if you just casually want to take photos, make videos, capture some moments, then an entry-level camera is probably going to be fine from any manufacturer. If you're looking to do this as maybe a career or just a very, very passionate hobby, I highly recommend moving towards the top end of your budget. Like if you're thinking $500 to $1,000, I would highly suggest going towards the top end. And I say this from experience because the first camera I bought with my own money was a Canon T6, and very quickly I felt like I'd already outgrown it and it didn't have some of the features I wanted. And this isn't me trying to upsell you, I'm just saying there's nothing worse than buying a camera and within 6 months feeling like you've outgrown it. Like maybe you think 1080p footage is good enough, and then you start shooting for clients and they want 4K, and you're like, well shoot, my camera can't do it. Now I've got to upgrade. Everyone's got a different budget. Just make sure if it's something you want to take seriously, that you're not skimping out. Like if you're a college student, go a couple weeks without that beer money, invest it in a nicer camera. Alright, so I know for a fact that was overwhelming. It was a lot. Thanks for sticking with me so long. Now, I don't expect you to have all these things completely memorized. The idea here is to get you thinking about these things. Maybe you're like, oh, maybe I should look at ports, or oh yeah, my camera does need a flip screen. That's sort of what this video is to just lay out a ton of features, and maybe it'll help you decide between two different cameras. Man, I haven't made a YouTube video in a while. It feels good. But as always, hopefully this video helped you out. If you have any questions, definitely drop them in the comment section down below. Help each other out. These days I am struggling to get to everyone's comments, so you guys can help each other out in the comment section, that'd be awesome. And as always, have fun, stay creative, and I'll see you all in the next one.